Last week, if you remember, we were talking about looking or planning for 2021. And remember, we saw that you needed a proper foundation. Remember, we saw that in Matthew 7. You can build on on sand, or you can build it on a rock. We saw also you have to have a proper outlook. We can plan whatever you like, but according to James, we want to do whatever the Lord wills. We need to be doing the same. We also remember we talked about in Luke. Talked about with Zacchaeus, a new interior. If the Lord's really working in your life, it'll come out in your actions. And obviously with Zacchaeus, he was willing to pay back everyone he cheated fourfold. Obviously it showed a real change in his life. And so people can say what they like, but do people see changes in our life? If we're really following the Lord, people will see changes in what we say or what we do. You also remember we have a new day, according to Philippians chapter 3. Remember Paul said, forget what's behind us. How many of you like to forget 2020? We can learn from 2020, but 2021 is a new year. So how are we going to handle it? And remember, we talked about that there. We ended up last week, if you remember, with a new pattern. And I'd like to think a little bit about the new pattern. Remember in Luke chapter 6 and verse 40, a pupil is not above his teacher, but when he is fully trained to be as his teacher. With that in mind, I want you to think about it. When we go to plan in 2021, how of us resemble the corporate world? How does a corporate world like the refinery, how do they plan for 2021? How do they plan? You know, we have machinery, things are getting old, they're going to be doing turnarounds, doing things. Everything is planned on different things. Okay, the information they get to make plans. How of us plan that way? And how of us plan or resemble the planning of our Lord? How did he plan? Or how his pattern was. And I want you to think about, when you think about that pattern of the early church also, if you remember we were supposed to be like our pupil is above his teacher, we should be like Christ. There's only one question the disciples ever asked Jesus to teach them. Now I want you to think about that. If you had Jesus in front of you today, how many of you would ask him a lot of things to help you with? Lord, teach us to put it in. Keep my mouth shut. Whatever it might be. It's interesting. The disciples were with him 3.5 years, but they only asked him one question, recorded in Scripture. Lord, teach us to pray. Why did they ask him that question? So they saw the connection with what Jesus was able to do with his prayer life. How many times have your kids ever asked you or grandkids, teach me to pray? Do they see us that much of a pattern? So I want us to think about that. Look over in Luke chapter 5, the pattern of Christ. Like I said before, one of the greatest studies I ever had the privilege of doing just on my own was when I was challenged 45 years ago to study the prayer life of Jesus in the book of Luke. And so I started doing that then, and it really opened my eyes. But look in Luke chapter 5, and you'll notice just when it talks about with Christ, it gets off to verse 16 of Luke 5:16. But it says, but he himself would often slip away to the wilderness to pray. Why did he go to the wilderness?
Distraction.
Okay, so it's personal, it would be private, it's also a pattern, right? You'll notice if you look at the book of Luke, Jesus has not had one conflict yet. That doesn't happen until later in the next chapter. He's often going to pray, and if you look at it in chapter 5 earlier, people are so crowding him so much he had to get into a boat because so many people are around. Everything is going well. You find him praying in chapter 3 at the baptism when everything's going well. How many of us are praying when everything's going well? And do you think he was busy, so busy that if anybody had an excuse to say, I don't have time to go pray, it'd be Jesus. From the time he gets up in the morning to the time he goes to bed at night, do you think people are having demands on him? The sick are coming, he can't go anywhere with people not being there. So think about that. The pattern of Christ is so important for us to realize how important prayer was. As a human being, he was praying to his Father. It's also interesting, I think we need to recognize our place. Earlier in the chapter, if you remember, Jesus gets on the two boats and he goes out so that why would he get in the boats? To go out a little bit out off the water when the crowds are so, because the water would act as an amplifier, and he sits on the water, then everyone amplifies off the water and everybody on the shore can hear him. And so it would be why. But I want you to think about it. What does it say that the disciples do? If you notice in verse 4, when they read there, Jesus finishes speaking, he says to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Now what did Simon and John and James, what was their occupation? Fishermen. Do you think they know the Sea of Galilee? And it said they've been out all night. And it's, did they catch anything? Do you think they know the conditions and everything else about when you catch and so on? Is Jesus a fisherman?
No. Yes.
He is, and she's going to talk to him in a minute, but not the fisher of catching fish, of literal fish. But I want you to notice their answer, because how many of us, we're the experts of whatever field we're in, and God's telling us to do something different, what would we tell him? If he's telling us to go do something that we know how to do, will we listen? And notice in what they said. Simon said, "Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing. But at your bidding, I'll let down the nets." I don't understand what you're asking me to do. We've done it all night. It didn't work. But hey, you told me to do it, so I'm going to what? I'm going to do it. I think it's important for us to recognize our place and what his place is. But notice how important prayer is. Obviously, you notice then they had such a great catch. It said the nets were breaking, and it even tells us how many they caught. An amazing catch. So it was such a great catch, they knew there was no way that they could have done that on their own. And that's why you notice it then says in verse 10, "Do not be afraid. From now on you'll be catching men." Amazing thing then, notice in 11, when they had brought their boats to land, they left what?
Everything.
They left their fish. Boy, don't you think a lot of people came running? Hey, man, look at all 153 fish. Well, I think that'd be a pretty good catch. I have not caught more than 10 in my entire life. I mean, that'd be quite a catch. They left it all. They left their business to follow him because he bid them to. But I want to think that pattern then, when you think about it in the perspective. Go over to the next chapter then, chapter 6. Still looking at the pattern of Christ. In chapter 6, you'll find the very first conflict in the book of Luke that Jesus had. A major conflict with the religious leaders. They're filled with rage, and they're trying to think about how to get rid of him. Notice then in verse 12, after the great rage, it was at this time that Jesus went off to a mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer. Okay? After a major conflict, the time of Christ, you go out to a mountain at night, would you say you would probably be alone? How many people are, I'm sure they had just, it was all lit up, right? And just tell you how to get there. You'd have to carry a lantern or anything. But notice you'd go to a lonely place. He prays how long? All night. And who did he pray to? To the Father. And notice he's of the tribe of Judah. All of us can go directly to God in prayer. All of us. What does he do then the next morning after he prays all night, according to verse 13?
Chose his disciples.
How important, does he have a major decision to make the next day?
Yes.
Does he have more than 12 followers? Which 12 are you going to choose? Jesus then prays all night after a major conflict. He prays all night before a major decision. Most of us, if we have a major decision to do, what do? I need a good night of rest, which is true. But how many of us make it a major time of prayer? So you think about it, when you look at this, just the pattern of Christ, prayer was so important. And how important is prayer in Dalton Hill Baptist Church's life? It's interesting, one of the greatest speakers, I should say, and pastors of yesteryear is Charles Haddon. What type of education did he have? He had none. He didn't go to college. He had no theological training. And yet he's called one of the greatest preachers of the English language. What was it? What made him that way? Obviously he had a kind of a speaking voice. He has a fabulous speaking voice. He also had a great way of relating to the people, which obviously he was one of them. But according to himself, it's interesting, he was quite humble as well. When he first church that asked him to come was New Park Street Church in London. And they asked if he would be an intern for 6 months. Test it out. He came back to me and said, let's just do 3 months because you may not like me. That's interesting, isn't it? He then goes on, he goes to the great Metropolitan Tabernacle, which when he had thousands, there's over 60,000 showed up for his funeral. He preached recorded messages of his. There's 3,561 recorded messages. Over 100 were directly related to a prayer. Another 100 had prayer as a main emphasis in it. That's 1 out of every 17 messages he preached was on prayer. When he took people after he became famous and people would go visit the church, he would bring them to the basement on every occasion. And this is what he had to say. This is the powerhouse of this church. And in the basement there's people praying every single time. He recognized the reason the church was doing things was for what reason? Prayer. And I don't think what happens is, I think no matter who we are, you can be great at speaking, you can be great at any of it, but you have to recognize you have to be working with the Holy Spirit and taking it and never leave that no matter how good. Quite often we start that way, but we don't end that way. So I want you to think about that. How prominent is prayer in our life? How many of us have all these plans and then what do? Lord bless it, right? We can come up with all the plans and what we have. We need to start with prayer. It's interesting when you look at Nehemiah, he prayed for 4 months before the answer came. Let's start with prayer. Second thing, look over at Hebrews chapter 4 with me. Verse 15 and 16, we know that well. We refer to it a lot. But notice, first of all, not only is we have a pattern of Christ in prayer, but we have a person we go to. It's a priest, but notice what it has to say right here. It says, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who's been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." Notice the present part. It says, who cannot sympathize with our weakness. I want you to think back through Christ when he was here on this earth. Did his family ever oppose him?
Always.
They didn't come to it other than his mom and dad, but his siblings, they were opposed to him. Okay? So does he understand when family's against him? Did any of his followers ever kind of turn against him? Did Peter ever say you shouldn't go to the cross? Did any of them deny him? So does he understand what it's like to have people, close associates, turn against you? Even in his flesh, did he not say, "Father, take this cup from me"? So I think it's interesting. That's what's so amazing. We have a high priest who knows everything we're going through. It's not like the Queen of England. You remember when the Queen of England was addressed and they said to her, "Your people are dying. They have no bread to eat." And this is a direct quote. What did she tell them?
Give them cake.
Give them cake. Let them eat cake. If you don't have any flour to make bread, you're not going to have anything to make, because she was so far out of reality of where her people were at. How many of you are glad you have a person who understands everything you're going through? Which, by the way, would his temptation have been greater? Well, Satan came to him and presented him all three aspects of Matthew chapter 4. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And did Satan, when he said, if you'll do this, I'll give you the world? Because Satan had given him the world. He is the ruler of this world. But when you and I give in to temptation, we never withstand all the way to the end. Christ withstood to the end on every single temptation that he had. And we have a person like that. So sometimes you ever been around people that they do not understand people who don't succeed or can't do it? You know, they have done it and they expect everybody else to do what? But it's not the way we have. It's not the person that we have. Notice it says it sympathizes. I think it's interesting on the sympathize. And notice it has to do with feel for or suffer with. What's the shortest verse in the Bible in our English text?
Jesus wept.
Okay, John 11:35. Jesus wept. When was he weeping?
Lazarus.
Death of Lazarus. Did Jesus know he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead?
Yes.
So why is he weeping?
The pain for his sisters.
Because he saw the pain that they were in. Even though he knows he's going to raise him from the dead. Do we have a high priest up there right now who sees the pain that we're going through? Well, we may not understand, but he's up there weeping. Think about it. So we have this person, that's the present. Notice then I think, what about the past? But one who's been tempted in all things like we are. It's a lot easier to follow someone when they know what you're going through. There isn't anything that comes our way that he likewise has not had a situation like it. Family going against, friends, whatever it might be. He's been through all of it. And notice it says, yet without sin. Never did. And so I think it's amazing when you think about it. How many of us ever ponder the privilege of going before a sinless Savior in prayer? That's something, isn't it? Going before. You know, how many of us get all nervous when we're going before the president of the company or whatever it might be? We get to go before the sinless Savior. That's amazing. So you have the pattern of prayer. You have the person you're going to. Now I want you to know that it also says, what about a possibility? Look at the possibility in chapter 4 and verse 16, the first part of it. Because we have such a person, it says, therefore draw near with what?
Confidence.
Confidence. We have an opportunity. How many of us are drawing near? Now, how many of us are running away? You notice it also says with confidence. I want you to think about that drawing near, the opportunity that we have. You think about the book of Esther. It's not like in the book of Esther. The book of Esther, you remember, you weren't allowed with the Persian Empire, you weren't allowed in the king's presence unless you're asked for. And if you did come into his presence, he had a scepter, and in order to see him, if you came in unannounced, what did he have to do? Okay, you had to then, otherwise it was your life. We don't have, and by the way, Christ is higher than the Persian king, correct? And we don't have to, when we go into his presence in prayer, we don't have to have fear that he's going to put us to death, that he's not going to listen, that he doesn't want us there. He's saying, come with confidence. Child of God, come here. You know, but again, it's our option, isn't it? Also, it says, come with confidence. In James chapter 1, do not be double-minded, correct? Come with confidence. And so I think it's important for us when we look at it. One that really I'm always amazed at, and you have different gifts. And one of the gifts that people can have is the gift of faith. There are certain people that just have an amazing, we all are to have faith. We all come to Christ by faith. We're all to walk by faith. But there's some that have the gift of faith that's just unbelievable what they can do. One of them, I think of that, is George Mueller. And those of you who know much about him, when he had the orphans and so many kids were on the street in England, he was trying to, so he took so many of them in, not having any means. And he had one, he said, all right, let's bow down, let's pray and thank the Lord for the food that we're about to partake. They had no food. Now you're telling the children to bow their heads for food. When they finish praying, what's there? They have the different ones that broke down, and they have milk, and this is going to go bad. If you have any use for this milk or the cheese or the bread and so on, they break down, just happen to break down outside, right? But how many of us would have thanked the Lord when we don't know what's there? It's amazing. We don't know. But it's a step of faith each time. What about with Joseph we already saw a couple weeks ago? Each time he had a dream, go this far. And then what does he do? He waits for the next dream. Then he goes that far. Then he goes that far. Just one step at a time. So think about it. Here's this possibility that we have. So when you think about it, you have a pattern that we're following. We also have a person that we're going to. We have a possibility. I want you to notice the place that you have that you're going to. It's amazing. It says, to the throne of grace. Think about that. Going to a throne. Throne of who? If you and I were going before whoever you want to mention. You want to mention the president? He has a lot of power. How would you go before the president of the United States? Do you think he'd be allowed in? If you and I went to Washington today, would we be able to see the president? How many of you ever tried to get a hold of your senator? You ever written a letter? How many personal responses did you get? Or is by somebody in his office? But when you think about it, you're going to the throne of grace, but how many of us are going with lowly reverence? Recognizing who you're going to. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. We would be, most of us, if we were going to see the president, would be a little nervous going in there. But we have reverence when we go. Yes, we are told to call him Father, but he is still the creator of the world. And we need to have reverence when we go. And how many of us do? I think another one, think about it, how many of us are going with complete submission? When you go to God in prayer, how many of us are in complete submission? Was Christ in complete submission? At the Luke 22, Father, take this cup from me, but not my what?
Will with thine be done.
Complete submission. How many of us go to the Lord in prayer, and we've done so many good things for him, and we're telling him what to do? You're lucky to have me on your team, God, and this is what I need, and this is what I expect, and this is what, I think a lot of times we are telling him, the creator of the world, what he should do. Instead, we need to get in line with him, and what does he want us to do? So notice when we go to the throne, the lowly, reverence, complete submission, but how many of us have enlarged expectations? In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 20, and now it says, now to him who is able to do what? Exceedingly beyond what we all ask or think. I want you to think about that for a moment. He can do much greater than what you and I can even ask or think. When we go to prayer then, do we go with him with expectations? If we go with expectations, there's faith. If we go with no expectations, what is it? Lord, you can do it, but you won't do it for me. That's not expectations. I think it's important when we go and we think about it. It reminds me, I want you to think about this for a moment. In 2 Kings chapter 4, Elisha, if you remember, Elisha has the widow come to him. And her husband was a prophet, and he died. And they have a debt. And because of the debt, what do they do in the Old Testament? If a family cannot pay the debt, they would take the children as slaves until the debt's paid off. Okay, so they come to take her sons. She comes to Elisha, and what does Elisha say? What do you have in the house? All she has is a jar of oil. And what does he tell her? You and your sons get as many jars from the neighbors and fill them up. How many jars would you go get? How many would even go? Because if you have a jar of oil and you pour it into a bigger jar, what's going to happen? It's only going to get half full. And what'd they do? They went to the neighbors and they got the jars and they kept filling and filling and filling. And it didn't stop running until what? Until they ran out of jars. What would have happened if they'd got twice as many jars? Enlarged expectations. How many of us are not praying the way we could be praying because we're limiting God? And I think, we looked at it, we've tried to get a building, we've tried so many things. I don't know. Obviously, it hasn't been what God wanted us to do. We've tried to merge with other churches, it hasn't, whatever, hadn't. But how many of us are going to them? I don't know what it is. And obviously, with the COVID, it's a good thing in some aspects financially. But what does God want for us? I've asked the person to speak for us in about 4 weeks, just to hear what has happened at the church where he's at. He owns a marble place, and he pastors on the side. And just what's happened, God has done in Kuwaiti with his church and stuff, is to walk the faith. So he agreed. I saw him this last week, and he said, name a date. So trying to decide, I imagine we may even include the Sunday school just for him to give the story, because he's just an everyday worker, never wanted to be a pastor, never wanted to do any of it. And the Lord just led in different things. And I think it's good for us to hear from people who we can relate to. And so Brett will come and speak to us, but I think it'll be along this line that you'll see that. But notice also, I think, on me coming before the throne, how many of us are doing with the deepest sincerity? Am I really sincere when I come to him? Have any of you ever, Dad and I, when he worked with me all those years, we had so many customers that come up to us, and the yard looks so good. You guys do such a good job. And immediately in the back of your mind, after you've done it long enough, is what? What is it, Brian? What's next? What do you want? It's not the deepest sincerity. You just learned after a while, it's like, it's coming. They're telling you, buttering you up, because now they want you to go do something that's not on the schedule that they want to have done because somebody's coming over or whatever it might be. How many of us are going with the deepest sincerity? Sincerity means without wax. You're coming before him, which, by the way, does he know? He knows everything. So we're coming before the throne, and I want us to think about that. The second thing is the throne of what?
Grace.
Grace. Not a throne of law. It's a throne of grace. Important to remember that, because I've had people tell me, well, I can pray for others, but I can't pray for myself. I don't deserve it. You're exactly correct. There isn't one of us that deserve it. There isn't one of us deserve to go into the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and never sin and never get in his presence. We don't deserve it. Let's think about that grace part. The faults of my prayers will be overlooked. What I mean by that, in Romans chapter 8, verse 26, it says, we do not pray as we should. The Holy Spirit makes groanings too deep for words. There's times, how many of you ever prayed, Lord, I want this, this is what we need to do, and God's over here saying what?
No.
The song that Garth Brooks put out, what is it called? Unanswered Prayers. We think we know what's best, but God knows what's best. I've thought of that even again this past week. With all three of my kids, I thought I knew the person they ought to marry. This is who you ought to date. Thank God I was wrong on all three occasions, and they got a lot better mate than what I had originally picked out for them. I'm not God. Thank goodness. But I think about it, when we look at it, when we go before the throne of grace, our faults he overlooks. Second thing, our faults of the petitioner will not prevent him from successful prayer. Now, there could be sin in my life that keeps him from being answered, but he doesn't wait till I'm perfect. If he did, there'd never be a prayer he'd ever answer. I think it's important for us to recognize, he recognized, yes, I'm a sinner when I come before him in prayer. And that's why it's called grace and mercy. I don't deserve him to come there, but I need to be going. What about the desires of the pleader will be interpreted? You ever are wanting the Lord's will, you pray in this way, but he then recognizes, okay, this is what's best. Isn't that what it says? If a child asks for a fish, he doesn't give him a scorpion. He's interpreting what's best. And sometimes the no is what's best. There's times I've said before, my younger brother, when he was wanting to go into one aspect and God told him no, but where he's at now, he's a whole lot better than where he was hoping to go. Didn't see it at the time, but it's a lot better. So I think it's important for us to look at it. The question then, how do you approach the throne of grace? Do you do it, realize it's a real throne, and you realize with reverence and lowly and so on? How many of us are going there expecting something? I'm going there to receive it. How about the last one? What about the provisions? 16. That you may receive mercy and may find grace to help in time of need. So how many of us are going with confidence? We're going to the throne of grace, and we're going there to get grace and mercy. How many of us go to the throne and, Lord, this is what I want, and you owe it to me? He resists the proud and gives grace to who? The humble. When they were praying, you remember you had the one beating his chest and wouldn't even look to heaven, and Lord, had mercy on me. And then you had the Pharisee praying, Lord, you owe it to me. How much are going to get grace and mercy? We really need to recognize who we really are and who he really is. But I think it's important to recognize this grace and mercy that's there. Mercy is not giving me what I deserve. Grace is giving me what I don't deserve also, good things. And he can do far above what we can ask or think, but we don't ask. And so I think it's important for us to think about, how do we approach the throne? Do you approach the throne? And how do you do it? Why do you do it? When do you do it? If you know 2021, did 2020 throw us any curveballs? Is 2021 going to throw us some curveballs? Then I'm going to need to be praying, because did 2020 catch God off guard? Did it catch us off guard? So we need to be talking to him to help us on how to plan, how to do things. So think about it. When it comes to the pattern of Christ when he's praying, how prominent is prayer in your life? The second one, what about the person when you think about it? Do I ponder the privilege of going before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords when I pray? That's amazing. And when can you pray? And where can you pray? You mean you can even pray on 169? If you don't, I suggest you do. What about the possibility? Think about the possibility. How many of us are going to him with confidence in time of need? I am confident that you hear me, but I want your will. And then what about the provisions? How many of us, we really are going before it, and we really want what he wants to receive time of need? So think about it this week. We talk about the 2021. How important is prayer in your life? Important is prayer in your life. Important is prayer in your life. Important is prayer in your life.